The next part, after you install the inner and outer race, the next step you can do is to grease up the bearings and install them. And you can do this on your workbench away from the car if you want, and that's what I'm going to do here. So I'll show you how to do it. It's you first have to pre-install the spacer here. So that'll go in first. That just sits down in there, and it can move around a little bit. It'll when you put it onto the stub axle, it'll align itself. And then we will grease up the bearing and then put the bearing in place. And then the last piece we'll put on is the seal. So we'll press that into place, and it's just rubber, so it should be pretty easy to press in. So we'll do that now. Okay, so that's the probably the messiest part of the job, is just working the grease into all the little grooves and get it all in so that it's pressed. You basically work with your fingers and get the grease in all the crevices. And then once you get that done, you just seat the bearing down in there. And then take your seal, basically work some of that grease around the seal so it presses in nice and easy. Then you just push it right into place. And I'm just going to get a rubber mallet and probably just work it really gently around the edges, just to get that so that it sits nice and flush. So when you're done with it, this seal will sit flush inside of the hub. Okay, so I went ahead and just used a mallet to gently press that seal into place. So now you can see it's flush with the outside of the hub, and that's the way it should sit. And then when you bring this out to the car, you'll just feed this onto the stub axle that way. The last piece you can fit in is this spacer. The spacer will go on the stub axle and sit right up against the inside of the stub axle with the chamfered side towards the inside. So I'll go ahead and press that right in, and it's pretty easy to push in, and it'll sit right in there. And then when you put that on the stub axle, it'll all sit nicely. The next part of the hub and bearing reinstall is to just to fit the unit, obviously, to the spindle, the stub axle, I should say. So you just slide it on after you've already done the inner portion. Here's the, let me see if I can get my finger in there. Okay, right here is the spacer, and then inside is the bearing is already put in there. Obviously the race is in, and that the cone spacer is already in, and this rubber seal is installed flush with the hub. So you just slide that in to place, and then the front or the outer bearing will fit on. But in order to get the spacing right, let me slide it in first. Okay.
I'm not sure if you can see in there. Let me get the light. Okay, now you can see. You can see inside is that cone-shaped spacer, and that's the end of it right there. Now, in order to do this right, you need to order a new set of these spacers, shims they call them, and the biggest one is a 30, and then they go down to a .003. That's this one. It's when they come in the package. Actually, they came in my package. They were all together in one plastic baggie, so it was hard to tell which one was the smallest and which one was the largest. I think the easiest way is to just give them a little bit of a bend, and you can see the 003 will definitely bend easily, and you can kind of tell which one's how they progress from thinnest to thickest that way. So that's one way to help yourself out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the 30. I'm going to put that in, and that'll sit up against the cone, and then I'm going to use one of each of the other ones. Now, when I took this apart, it didn't have any of these, so whoever had installed this last time had done it the American way. I've heard it referred to as the American way, where you tighten down the bearings with the castle nut just till you start to get resistance, and then you back it off till you can hit the cotter pin in. Now that's one way to do it, and I've heard you can do that on these as well. And in that case, you wouldn't even put the cone spacer in the middle. You would just and you wouldn't use any of these shims. You would leave all that stuff out and just use the two bearings, the rubber gasket on the back, and then the rubber grease seal, and then the spacer on the back, and that's all you would need. But I'm going to do it the way it was intended to be done. So I'm going to use all these spacers and torque it down to actually 60 or 50 to 70 foot-pounds, I think is what the manual says. And then when I torque it down, I'll show you how to get the proper adjustment. So I'm going to use, for now, I'm going to use one of each of these spacers. And once we torque it down, if there's too much, if I have too much in there with the bearing, the outer bearing installed, the tab washer, and the castle nut on the outside, and I'll obviously tighten that down. I'll tighten that down to 60, and I'll see how much free play I should. I'll pause it right here so I can tighten that down, and then I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, well, that was weird because I used up every single one of the shims, each of the four different sizes, and it actually was perfect. So I had to, in order to demonstrate this to you guys, I had to I put the other 30 that's supposed to go on the other side in there, just so that you see how you adjust it. So I have the other 30 in there. So obviously there's too many, and this is what it'll do. I've tightened it down to 50 foot-pounds, and you can see this, obviously it'll go tunk, tunk, tunk as you push and pull on it. So there's too many spacers in there, and there's too much end float. You're supposed to the end float is supposed to be adjusted to .002 to .004 inches. Now, I don't know how to measure that. You got to get a special tool to measure that, but it should be just the barest amount of end float that you can possibly get with all of the shims that you're using. So I'm going to go back to the other install here, and I'm going to take off that 30, and I'm going to go back to the way I just had it, which was using all four of the shims. And it actually was near perfect. I could barely even move the hub assembly, it didn't tunk at all, and it still freely rotated on the stub axle. So I'll show you what that looks like. Here's a little quick tip while I'm going through this. If you guys find yourself putting shims in and out, trying to get it to the perfect end float, I found using a magnet is an easy way to kind of get inside there and get the shims out one at a time, so you can kind of work them out with the magnet. And that way, because you can't obviously get your finger in there to get the shims out. So I took that 30 out. So now I got the bearing out. I'm going to completely grease the bearing, and I had been dry installing it just to show how it was done, but now I'm going to fully grease it up and put it all back together with all the shims I have in there, and then I'll show you what it looks like when it's all done. So now we've got it all back installed with the correct number of shims, and you can see there's no tunking sound coming from the hub when I shake it, and it spins freely. So that's about perfect. I don't know if I could have gotten it any better than that, and I just happened to get lucky. I put in every single one of the 3 or 4 sizes of shims in there, and it worked out perfectly. So obviously you put the cotter pin back in and bend the ends up, and then the last piece will be the cap that you fit on the top, and I'll do that later. But that's it. That's a complete step-by-step of reinstalling, or actually removing the old bearings and putting brand new bearings on a 1968 MGC on the front axle.